Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to take a look at Canada's role in World War I. So I've got a short little lecture here for you. We're going to talk about four topics: the War Measures Act, conscription, the internment of the Ukrainians, and Vimy Ridge. Most of it, a good portion of it's going to be kind of me talking to you, and then at the last part with Vimy Ridge, we're going to have you pause and watch a video. So I'm just going to turn this presentation here for you. So let me share this screen. And there we go. So Canada's role in World War I. So essentially what we're looking at is this idea of national interest that you discussed last week, right? Countries pursue their national interests for three reasons: safety and security, economic prosperity, quality of life. So how does this connect to what Canada was doing? So what we're going to look at are Canada's domestic policies and tension within Canada during World War and see how that reflects our national interest. A couple keywords to think about. One being this idea of ultranationalism. Ultranationalism is this idea of extreme radical nationalism. Throughout history, we see this largely with kind of our authoritarian dictators like Hitler and Stalin. But the Americans and the Canadians, we had ultranationalistic type tendencies as well, just looked at it in a bit of a different way. So keep that in mind. This idea of conscription or mandatory military service, and this idea of xenophobia or fear of foreigners, fear of people that are different, often connects into this idea of racism and discrimination. So we'll be looking at those three ideas throughout today. The first thing that we're going to talk about is the War Measures Act. The War Measures Act gets passed for the first time in 1914, right? Canada's a young nation. Canada, right, Confederation was signed in 1867, so Canada's not that old by the time Canada goes to war in 1914. And essentially, the War Measures Act, which you would have been initially introduced to in Unit 1 in relationship to the FLQ crisis. Naturally, that was not the first time it was implemented. 1914 was. But if you remember, the War Measures Act gives basically complete sweeping powers to the government in order to suspend the civil liberties of people. And by implementing the War Measures Act, this enables government to go around Parliament, right, to bypass the Parliament. No debate, no discussion for things that they felt was necessary for the war. So this essentially, the War Measures Act and implementing the War Measures Act basically meant that the leadership of the nation was not accountable to the House of Commons anymore, which is where the elected representatives of all of the people sat. That small little council, the Privy Council as we call it, of the cabinet and the prime minister could pass without debate and were not accountable to the government at all. So how was this War Measures Act implemented? So there's a variety of ways the War Measures Act was used. The creation of the internment camps, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Another way that they could to do things was if you were a factory, you could be told that you were no longer producing farm equipment, for example, and now you are starting to produce war materials. We see shifts right now in our current society in relationship to manufacturing and COVID-19, but those corporations voluntarily doing this in order to help fight. They're not mandated to by government, at least not at this point. So in terms of background information of who's involved in the war here in Canada, right? We know the war is not fought on Canadian soil, but in Europe. So we've got Canadian troops. We've got about 630,000 Canadians and Newfoundlanders that serve in the First World War in some capacity. About 172,000 are wounded, and just over, or I guess a lot over, 60,661 soldiers lost their lives. And ultimately, this war that spans 4 years is the bloodiest conflict in Canadian history to date. So why do Canadian soldiers get sent to fight? This war is so far away. So remember, Canada's a very young nation. Canada does not have its own constitution yet, among other things. So the Canadian government didn't actually choose to go to war in 1914. But it is Britain's joining of the war that pushes Canada into the war. So Britain declares war on Germany and Austria-Hungary after the invasion of Belgium by Germany. And this is going to drag Canada into the war automatically because of our ties with Great Britain. We don't choose to go to war, we get dragged into the war. So our prime minister at the time was Robert Borden, and he implements the War Measures Act that we just previously talked about a few minutes ago. So this War Measures Act gives the government tremendous power over the Canadian people, and it enables the government to do a number of different things. First being censorship. Any type of media, well, it's 1914, so you're looking at newspapers. So media communication, and the communication of between people. So like opening letters, right? Mail was a big thing, right? Handwritten letters. And so that they could open that. So your privacy was gone. They could seize property and possess without explanation. And they're going to do this to a number of different people. They could arrest or detain or deport you for no reason, without charge, without trial. They controlled the movements of the harbors, right? Vessels coming in and going out. They controlled movements by air. Now it's 1914 to 1918. There's not a lot of movement in the air, right? The plane just kind of gets introduced at the end of the First World War. That'll be very different in the Second World War, right? So basically all transportation can be controlled, and trading and production and the manufacture of goods is also controlled, and that can be dictated to you as a factory owner. So the first topic that we're going to look at within this idea of the War Measures Act is the internment of the Ukrainians. So to contextualize, right, Ukraine is not a country at this stage of the game. Ukraine is a portion of Austria-Hungary. And Austria-Hungary, if you recall from last day's lecture, is a member of the Triple Alliance. And Austria-Hungary has a large population of Ukrainians. And Canadians of Ukrainian descent, right? Canada had a lot of Ukrainians at this stage, right? With settlement of the West, many farmers. Many Canadians feared that the Ukrainians themselves were spies, and they were working for Austria-Hungary, which in reality was not the case. But the Canadian government basically determined that they were enemy aliens because they were citizens living in Canada from countries, although many were Canadian citizens, they were from countries that were legally at war with us. Therefore, they were considered enemies and potentially even spies. So what did they do? If you look at these pictures very much resemble the rounding up of the Jewish population, the picture on the right, the rounding up of the Jewish population in Europe in the Second World War. So ultimately speaking, Canada is going to intern, basically put into camps, over 8,500 so-called enemy aliens in 24 different, they called them receiving stations and camps, between 1914 and 1920. Well, Ms. Salino, the war ends in 1918. Why are they in the camps till 1920? Well, they were still considered those aliens. And so it's going to take a couple years for things to settle down, much to the violation of individual rights and freedoms. So in addition to the 8,500 or so that were interned, an additional 80,000 were forced to carry identity papers and report to police offices regularly so their movements could be observed and controlled. Ultimately speaking, the end of the war and the subsequent time period after, it has never been proven. There's no evidence to suggest that any Ukrainian Canadians ever sympathized with Austria-Hungary and planned to destroy Canada's war efforts. If we look at the map, you'll notice where a lot of these camps were. So the internment camps were kind of like concentration camps, the best comparison, right? No gas chambers or anything like that, but right, like camps with barracks and fences. And so they're largely in the West, scattered throughout the East, but largely in the West. And then you also have a number of work sites, and again scattered, but lots of them in the west. And you'll notice they're in our national park areas. The national park system in Alberta and in the interior of British Columbia was in part built by these Ukrainians that were in these work camps. And there's actually memorials. So if you're looking, if you're hiking in various parts of Banff National Park and Jasper, depending on where you are, there are actually plaques in remembrance of the atrocities that were committed here as an apology to those communities. This idea of the work camps, right? The government frequently interned people, the internees, on these massive labor projects, like I mentioned, Banff National Park. And they typically got paid 25 cents a day, which is very, very little. And what's really kind of the bigger thing to note is, in addition to losing their individual rights and freedoms, they also were disenfranchised. Now, franchised. So ultimately speaking, these were Canadian citizens who had the right to vote. But during this time period, during the war, when they were interned and identified as aliens, they lost that right to vote. The government removed that right from them as a way to try to prevent them from voting on certain measures potentially down the road that might impact Canada negatively. But as I mentioned, no one was ever proved to have been sympathizing with Austria-Hungary. It's not until November 2005, so you guys were kids, when the government of Canada passed Bill C-331, recognizing the internment of the Ukrainian Canadians during the war, and essentially called for reparations to be given to the community, the Ukrainian Canadian community. Actually, most of those who were interned had since passed away just by age. So the government basically tried to negotiate a settlement with the community at large as an apology. Our second topic that we're going to look at here is the conscription crisis of World War I. And conscription is that idea of mandatory military service. Throughout history, a lot of nations had conscription. And even in contemporary society, a lot of nations in the world, I think there's about 35 or so, that have mandatory military service of some kind based on age, gender, different volumes of time, maybe university educated versus not. A lot of different countries have a lot of different rules related to this. Canada does not have mandatory military service, as you know, at this point in time. So conscription in Canada during the First World War. Conscription was a very divisive issue. And by the end of the First World War, Canada loses 65 to 66,000 troops in battle, and another 200,000 or more get injured. And we've got these high mortality rates, not like in Europe, but still very high for the contribution, right? 10% or so of our soldiers. And so because of the high death rates across the world in this battle, fighting with the military of France, Russia's almost being defeated, the Germans are on the move. The Prime Minister of Canada at the time promises that Canada will send 500,000 more troops. Canada only has a population of about 8 to 11 million in this time period. So this is really significant. Canada only had about 1.5 million men at the age that they identified meant that you could fight, so 18 to 40-ish, right? So we only had about 1.5 million. And they said, well, we're going to send you a third of them. Well, that's not going to happen. We can't get that many people to enlist voluntarily. So Prime Minister Borden and his government, they want to show the British that they're doing their part and they're helping. And so they passed something called the Military Service Act in 1917. This is the conscription action. So this required men of military age 18 to 40 to 45, somewhere in there, to register to be potentially drafted. So if you were 18, you had to go register to say, I am an able-bodied male between these ages. I am registered for the draft. Ultimately speaking, about 100,000 of those register get drafted or selected, and then about 24,000 of those see action by the end of the war. But the implementation and the passing of this Military Service Act, right, through the War Measures Act, that's what's enabled to do this, because this would never really happen in a democratic country otherwise. This causes great controversy across Canada for various reasons. And those are some of the reasons that we're going to talk about here. So in terms of the division, you can see on the screen here those who were for and those who were against. In terms of the for category, English-speaking Canadians, right? Most were pretty loyal to Britain still in 1917. Government officials, British immigrants, right? Very closely tied to Europe, families of soldiers, and older Canadians who couldn't be conscripted and might fall into one of those other categories listed there. In terms of who's against this, French Canadians. Remember, this is the first time, really, that the French and the British are fighting on the same side. Historically speaking, they've been at war with each other for generations, and many just can't get past that. And so the French Canadians do not support going to war for the British, even though the British and the French were on the same side. A lot of farmers don't support this because, you know, this would be taking those young able-bodied males away from the farms and sending them to Europe, which would have implications not only for pulling crops off, but seeding and all of the things that go on a farm. Unionized workers, non-British immigrants, among others. And so what we see is this public division related to conscription, but also division related to language, agriculture, religion, political rights of women, immigrants, right? This was a very politically divisive issue. And we kind of just already talked about why Francophones were not very supportive of this, right? This idea of supporting the British was not something that kind of went along really well. There's other issues related to the language question in Canada as well. In Manitoba, they had a fully funded French school system, right? And Manitoba has a very large Métis population at this point in time, very large French settlements, and many Canadian Francophones, so not Quebecois, but many Canadian Francophones were realizing that they weren't really equal partners in this Canadian Federation. They weren't getting treated fairly. They didn't feel as though they were getting treated fairly. And so as a result, they really didn't continue to support the war or conscription. And this forced conscription caused a lot of tension for the decades that followed. Ultimately speaking, you see racism using linguistic or racial smears. You see a lot of just back and forth within communities, and it's very, very divisive. Ultimately speaking, conscription does prevail, and it requires this Military Service Act. Males between 20 and 45 are subject to this draft if called upon. And generally speaking, that map on the bottom right here, you can see that, you know, largely Quebec was opposed, but for the most part, the rest of the country agreed. Now, you would have pockets in Manitoba, pockets in all of the provinces that disagreed, but the overwhelming majority was fairly supportive of this. When we look at the numbers, you can pause this if you like and take a closer look at the numbers. In terms of it breaks down by province of eligible males by province, percent of those of the population that was eligible, how many voluntarily enlist on their own, okay, and then you can see how many were conscripted by looking at the difference here, or I guess on this category on the far right. So it breaks it down by province, and it's fairly representative of representation by population. For the most part, you would think that BC would have a little bit more than, say, Alberta and Saskatchewan based on population, but considering they have a larger population than Alberta, And one thing that's interesting to note is, right now, as you know, Saskatchewan has a much larger population, a smaller population than British Columbia. But in 1914, when life was still very much dominated by agriculture, the city of Vancouver was not nearly the size that it was now. And when we look at the graph of comparing enlistments versus losses, right? Enlistments very high at the beginning of the war, and then they kind of dip towards, in that first few months, right? Because everybody signs up right away. Then there's a dip. People think, oh, okay, well, we're not going to be done by Christmas like we thought, so there's a bit of a spike, and then it kind of starts to peter out. Then the war is raging on, but Canada's not experiencing a tremendous number of losses, so enlistments increase. But once we start experiencing losses, that's when we see the dip in enlistments start to happen. And as you can see, we've experienced tremendous loss kind of between April 1916 and December 1917, right? Low numbers as a result. 1917, the Military Service Act gets implemented, and now we have in those enlisting largely that are conscripted in. So the result, as we've mentioned a couple times already, you've got polarized provinces, polarized ethnic and linguistic groups, even polarized communities and families. For a lot of people, right, they thought it was necessary and important to contribute to the war. The others thought that this was oppressive and this was a violation of individual rights and freedoms that people in Canada took for granted. Ultimately speaking, historians believe that the impact on Canada's war effort was fairly minimal. By the time 1914 hits, all of those 100,000 or so that get kind of enlisted, about 48,000 actually get sent overseas, right? They all get trained in Canada, but they get sent overseas, and only about half of those actually serve on the front. So about 24,000 of them serve on the front lines, which is still a significant number, right? So about a quarter of those that get enlisted through conscription see armed conflict in battle. And speaking of armed conflict and battle, our last topic today is going to be Vimy Ridge. Some of you may have heard of it. Some of you may have seen this monument in France. Battle of Vimy Ridge is a significant turning point in Canadian history and the development of Canadian identity. And we're going to have you watch a video clip here in a few minutes. Essentially, for the first time in World War I, all 4 Canadian divisions fight as one together. And they are for the first time under the command of Canadian generals, not British generals and not French generals. And these divisions make up citizens from all 9 provinces of Canada at this time, because remember, Newfoundland and Labrador does not become a province until 1949. So this is my last slide of talking, and then we'll get you to watch a video. But it's important to contextualize where Vimy Ridge is. Okay, so here is France. Okay, this is Belgium, and here is Germany. Okay, Vimy Ridge is right here where my cursor is, and Vimy Ridge is a very strategic position in northern France, in that it borders Belgium, which Germany invaded, as you know from last day, in order to attack the French. And this little Vimy town here is called Vimy. At the ridge itself is about 110 meters high and about 8 to 10 kilometers in length. So it's very large, and it is a clear strategic position, because if you control this ridge, you can see from the top of it advancing troops all around you. And so they had clear views of the various plains surrounding it. And it was very heavily fortified. And the French and the British tried taking this ridge multiple times in the lead up to 1917 and failed. So what the Canadian generals did is they studied these battles, and they studied other battles, successes and failures in other parts of Europe, in order to come up with a plan to attack said heavily fortified region. The Vimy Ridge has a huge memorial. The memorial is towering. on the site of a portion of the battle. And it gets unveiled in 1936 to honor not just the troops that conquered and died at Vimy Ridge, but all 60,000 plus Canadian troops who sacrificed their lives in the war. So here's where we're going to take it, where we're going to stop. And in your PowerPoint that we released to you is this video clip. It's narrated by Peter Mansbridge, and it looks at why Vimy Ridge still matters. It's about 15 minutes. Take a listen and a watch to learn a little bit more about Vimy Ridge. Well, I hope you learned a little bit about Canada's role in World War I today, and I hope you have a great day. See you later.